I went to the next arcade, and it was actually the second in the series. It had the additional thief character, which was super fun. There was yet another one where one type of hunter alien joins up with space marines to fight bug aliens. That one was amazing. Then there were a pair of cabinets where giant monsters climbed up buildings and smashed, and lastly a cabinet where you were cowboys. I remember the home release being heavily censored. This was literally arcade heaven, and they were all categorized. Then there were the shooters. They had the first edition zombie shooter that essentially ceased to exist after the source code was lost in a disaster. Then they had every sequel as well. They had a shooter where you shot futuristic robots, and several more where you were a police officer. Then lastly, a spin-off shooter in a booth that looked like an escape pod based on Starship voyages fighting assimilated cyborgs. On the opposite wall was apparently where the rowdy machines went, so I walked over to check them out. There were 5 different dance arcade machines. They had the steel dance pads, which were absolutely glorious to dance on. Next to those were racing arcade cabinets that made you feel like you were actually in a race car. Those divided the dancing arcades from the fighting cabinets. They had every major version of the street fighting and mortal fighting varieties. They also had 3D fighters as well as ones where you had swords. They also had the multi-arcade cabinets where you could choose between every single version of the sword fighting game. It had something like 6 versions of the sword fighting game and another 5 or so versions with the other main fighters on it that they had produced. They had 2 of these side by side so people could run whatever they wanted. A third one had every single co-op shooter that the company had produced with over-the-top, unrivaled sprite work. Then, just when I thought I had seen everything, I realized there was extra space on this side of the cabinets, and it was actually a single bowling lane. I followed the second half of the outside of the bowling lane past the arcades. There was also a tabletop shuffleboard and several large and robust-looking foosball table, and one of those mini basketball games. This luxury yacht would be absolute paradise if you just wanted to goof off forever. I couldn't imagine anyone ever wanting to leave. I walked back across the arcade room to see what was next. I had a pretty good idea what it would be. I stepped into the next area, and it was a bit of a foyer. You could go down to the first deck from here or across the way. There were signs that said entertainment the way I had just came, dining on the way down, and then cabin was across. I looked down into the darkness and didn't see or hear anything. I pointed my AR down and flicked on my light anyway. Nothing down there but floor. I let my AR go back to hanging where it spent most of its time and went across to the cabin area. I went past the rooms, glancing briefly in each one. I checked my phone, and I'd been about this for about an hour. I was starting to get sleepy. I took a bite of jerky and a drink of water and tried to move my arms in a circle a bit to try to get the blood flowing. I blinked a few times, then hopped up and down a few times, then returned to looking around. The inside of the rooms looked weird, like each were themed. There were old Western themed ones and 1950s themed. There was a spaceship themed one and another that made it seem like you were out in the forest camping. One that looked like you were out on the beach and another that looked like you were sleeping outdoors in the city. There were a few different video game related ones and a few that looked like honeymoon suites of varying romantic themes. I looked in those to make sure nobody was in them, but did my best to not imagine all the hanky-panky that went on. I did imagine that cleaning them up involved a lot of hazmat clothing and hazard pay for employees. I let a chuckle out as I imagined people in biohazard clothing cleaning up a room full of hearts and spinning beds or whatever. The rest of the rooms were average and non-themed. I checked them all until I reached the edge of the cabins. I imagine all total this yacht could comfortably sleep around 60 people. That included the staff and captain. When I got to the end of the cabins, I thought to myself that I was nearly to the end of this yacht. I was starting to get a feel for the space, having prior walked back and forth from the outside. The next room was a cozy bar of sorts. I peeked behind the bar to make sure nobody was hiding behind there, and there was nobody. I looked around briefly. There was a very nice, full-sized pool table The walls had paintings done of local areas. There was a painting of the Space Needle. Next to it was one of Mount Rainier. And there was one painting of the old Kingdom that was very tastefully done. There was a painting of the Mariners baseball team with their star pitcher pitching a no-hitter. There was a painting of the UW Huskies playing in the Rose Bowl, and there was a painting of the Supersonics playing in the playoffs. Finally, there was a photo of a Sounders game. Large swathes of the stands holding anti-fascist branding and signage. Photos must have been taken in between violent political signage bans and the team being traded due to loss of revenue. Seemed to be a reoccurring theme that the SJWs didn't have the independent finances to back up their causes. Their financiers stopped funding them to go advertise at the soccer games, apparently. Most likely they weren't bringing in enough outside income anymore. Everyone else must have gotten pissed prior when they realized the team itself was in significant part Bolsheviks, so the team was done the second outside financing split. Then the inquiries started dropping, related to basically wealthy people subsidizing their own games and stadiums, basically. A lot like before Hollywood collapsed, paying people to go see their movies, where they had so much money they could buy their own box office smashes one after the other, similarly to how people had been purchasing their way onto the bestseller list for books. Local authorities generally looked the other way as long as they got their taxes and everyone stayed employed. To hell that no actual fans were going to the games anymore. More Coliseum bullcrap as the world fell down around them. Lastly was a painting of an unfinished Coliseum with a simple S that looked like a squid representing the hockey team that never was. The poor Kraken that never got to play after being appropriated by yet another identity movement. Underneath it was framed a hoodie from the merch shop before it slid into the ocean. The dock broke off during an unfortunate minor earthquake some time back, a sort of metaphor for the potentially awesome team, I suppose. Washed by nostalgia, but now disgusted at the whole thing, I returned to looking around, trying to get my mind off the nepotism and crony capitalism. I looked around more, and there were some paintings of a very popular dystopian cyberpunk game on one of the walls. There was a portrait of the main character looking very stoic and confident with his orange-blonde curly hair and tight specs. There were more pictures I recognized, such as the Boeing field that almost flooded after the storm when the dam partially failed. One big spring runoff with heavy rain combined, and there'd be no more Kent. There was a painting of SeaTac Airport, and next was a picture of the Tacoma Dome. That entire area had been completely taken over and was now ruled by gangs. Everyone that wasn't able to make it out of Olympia that wanted to go north for their side's city-state sanctuary of Sealth had been cut off ever since. Hopefully, the Puyallup tribe could help with that a little. Maybe slowly start to secure a new piece of this Salish region or some such. That was just about all the paintings, and I looked through the door to see what was through the next areas. It looked like an outside exit. I could hear the waves gently wishing against the Anastasia. I threw my light shining through the tinted glass the proper direction. I could see the dingy swimming pools, and saw that I was at the end of my second floor tour. I felt distinctly like something was behind me that moment. Despite seeing nothing in my peripheral reflections of the tinted windows, I turned around abruptly. Nobody was there, of course, but I was sure I'd felt it, that someone was there behind me. I looked behind the bar again and behind the billiards table, but nobody was there. Maybe the paintings were getting to me. I didn't know. There was a door to the bar's back room, presumably where the rest of the alcohol was. It was locked, of course, and seemed very secure. I decided to check the first floor, then call it a night. I had no idea where the gentleman was that shared the ship with me, and it seemed to be that if he didn't want to be found, that I was not going to find him. I returned to the second floor foyer and looked down the stairs again with my AR's mounted flashlight. I swept around for good measure, then carefully headed down. Chapter 12, Where the Cool People Hang Out. Floor 1, dining room and kitchen, night, day 1. I was starting to get an idea that the luxury yacht was very well set up. They could make food in the kitchen and bring it up to the bar if they wanted. That is, if customers wanted to eat at the bar. The staff could bring drinks from the bar to the swimming pool area if they wanted. There was a mini bar in the dance room, and down here was no exception.